Back when now President Donald Trump was running for president in 2016, people on both the right and the left said, please, like that guy is going to be the Republican nominee, let alone the president of the United States. I think we all learned from that election year that we shouldn't underestimate an outsider. So why in 2023 are we underestimating a Democratic outsider, that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He's leading in many of the polls that are taken of Democratic presidential candidates, and it seems that he may even be leading over Republican presidential candidates. So we're going to be talking about what his positions are, why he has gained such popularity, why he is really the subject of persecution from the Democratic National Committee, which is spending all kinds of money to try to silence him. And then finally, a new development with regard to the primaries that actually would make RFK Jr.'s ascension in the Democratic Party more likely. RFK Jr., for those who don't know, is the nephew of President John F. Kennedy and the son of former Attorney General and U.S. Senator RFK, Robert F. Kennedy. He's also an environmental attorney and the founder of the Children's Health Defense. He has been a longtime critic of vaccine mandates, and in fact, he actually has written a book on the subject. According to The Economist and YouGov, which jointly conducted a poll, RFK Jr. has the highest net favorability of all of the 2024 presidential candidates. Also, there is a July poll which says that he has a 47% favorability rating and a 26% unfavorability rating. That is compared to President Biden's 39% favorability rating and 53% unfavorability rating. So it seems that RFK Jr. is 8 percentage points ahead of President Biden in terms of the people who approve of him, and President Biden is about double of the percentage points ahead of RFK as far as the people who disapprove of him. RFK Jr. has said that he is, quote, running for president of the United States because the Democratic Party has lost his way. Some people have accused him of being a dino. We hear often of rhinos, Republicans in name only, and some people have said, wait a minute, well, RFK Jr. is a Democrat in name only because a lot of his positions are conservative, those critics say, and yet he identifies as a Democrat. I actually have a different point of view. I think that a lot of RFK Jr.'s stances, if you will, are actually what the Democratic Party once was. It was once a liberal party. Dennis Prager often makes the distinction between liberal and leftist. Liberals support the founding principles of the United States: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, closed and strict borders, etc. But leftists are totally against those founding principles of our country and actually say that they are bigoted and somehow white supremacist. So RFK Jr. is a liberal in the real sense of the term. He says that he's trying to bring the Democratic Party back to what it once was, the party, as he says, of the JFKs, the RFKs, and the MLKs. Quote, the DNC has around $2 billion, and they're spending that money generously to try to marginalize me in many ways. But I think most Democrats, RFK Jr. says, care about one thing more than anything else, which is to beat Donald Trump. He says that he is the president, or he is the candidate, I should say, that could do that even more than President Joe Biden. Quote, I think people are tired of being lied to by the government and by the media. My dad, RFK, ran against an incumbent president in his own party, Lyndon B. Johnson, during a divisive time. I'm running against a larger challenge because I am facing an entire infrastructure that is against me from my own party and big tech and the pharmaceutical industry. That is absolutely true. Even if you look back to this summer in July of 2023, there was a hearing at the U.S. House of Representatives on censorship, and the Democrats in the House actually tried to block RFK Jr. from testifying at that hearing. RFK Jr., among other things, had his Instagram account temporarily suspended because he supposedly violated the COVID-19 rules. And so RFK Jr. did end up testifying, but not without the robust opposition of Democrats. So he capitalizes on those things to say, wait a minute, this is not who we are. We do not criminalize or try to quash people who disagree with our political position. The truest sense of liberalism and what the Democratic Party once stood for was that everyone ought to be able to speak freely. So let's go through here some of his positions. Again, by modern standards, they do seem to be more in line with Republican values than with Democratic values. But if we look at the grand scope of history, as I've been saying, they're just plain liberal, as frankly, a lot of Republican positions are liberal. For instance, we hear often that opposition to just full-scale allowed abortion is a conservative issue. That wasn't always a conservative issue. It used to be pretty mainstream in the Democratic Party, as President Bill Clinton said, that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. But now in 2023, things have gotten so divisive and extreme that just saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't abort a baby at 9 months, that is considered to be conservative. It's also conservative in 2023 to say that there are two genders. To literally just express objective reality is now being aligned with one political party over another. So RFK Jr. is trying to go back to the way things once were, where there was more of a center core shared values, like the central intersecting circles of a Venn diagram. So the first thing was this addiction to war. It used to be a Democratic Party position to be more opposed to war. For instance, the Democrats were historically against the Vietnam War, whereas Republicans were trying to increase aid to the South Vietnamese. RFK Jr. says, quote, one of the big problems that we have in our federal government is the addiction to war. President Biden went to Congress recently and asked for another $24 billion for the Ukraine war. We've already spent $8 trillion on wars since 9/11. If we had just kept that money at home, we would have had childcare for every American, we would have had free college for every American, and we would be able to pay our social security system. Seems like a pretty legitimate, not necessarily Democrat position to me, or Republican position, just a common sense position. He's also talked about the dangers of COVID-19 vaccine mandates. He has said staunchly that he is, quote, not an anti-vaxxer. People use that pejorative, RFK Jr. says, to describe me, to silence me or marginalize me. He's just said that the COVID-19 vaccine should not be forced upon people. It should be my body, my choice. People's decision to take that vaccine, which is really still in its early stages of being in existence. And certainly with the boosters, they've only been tested on mice. Mice, everyone. Not even human beings. RFK Jr. also has pretty strong positions about the border, which is contrary to the Democratic Party stance. He has said that the amount of undocumented immigrants which have come into the United States during President Joe Biden's tenure in office pose, quote, a humanitarian crisis to the United States. It is a disaster, RFK has said, because we do not have the financial resources to support that many undocumented immigrants. We are seeing in cities like New York City that it is posing a huge, huge threat to the city and its financial viability. Mayor Eric Adams actually recently announced that he is slashing every New York City governmental department's budget by 15% in order to accommodate those 110,000 migrants that are under the care of New York City. He said this is a fiscal disaster, and it is also, as mentioned, a humanitarian disaster, because those 7 million undocumented immigrants in the United States do not have any legal status, and so they are more vulnerable to those who will exploit them for labor and for sex flex work. Think about it from the perspective of an employer. You can get away with paying an undocumented immigrant $5 or $6 a month for their work because you can hold it over their head. Hey, you can't sue me. Because if you sue me, you're not a legal citizen of this country and you'll just end up being deported. So RFK Jr. highlights that. Isn't that a pretty woke position to advocate for people who are vulnerable to certain types of oppression? Seems so to me, but a lot of Democrats hate him. RFK Jr. also has some pretty bold, by Democratic Party standards in 2023, positions on the economy. He cites a Wall Street Journal report from 2021, which says that 200 corporations are buying tens of thousands of single-family homes all across the United States, including neighborhoods. And what they're doing is that they're jacking up the rental prices so that they get to make a revenue off of buying these single family homes. RFK Jr. has said, if we're the Democratic Party and we're anti-elite and we're anti-corporation, we ought to oppose these corporations coming in and doing this. It is expected that major companies in the United States, Fortune 500 companies, are going to own 40% of single family homes all across the country by 2030. RFK Jr. is saying enough is enough. He's talked about the arrogance, the hubris, and the tyrannical nature of these forums, these committees, these task forces, such as the World Economic Forum, where people like Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, and Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, wax eloquent about a new world order, a great reset that needs to occur. But that new order and that new reset is defined on their terms, where everyone else has to, for instance, cut their carbon emissions, stop drilling on lands. But then these members of the elite get to fly around on private jets to sit in fancy conference rooms and drink fancy wine and talk about the new order for all the rest of us plebeians. Finally, as mentioned, RFK Jr. is very bold on big tech censorship. He doesn't think that anyone should be censored in the United States for their opinions. That is a classically liberal free speech position. And of course, he has also talked about the cancel culture outside of big tech censorship, just the cultural idea that people should be made to feel bad or wrong for possessing certain opinions. So we know that RFK Jr. has been really soaring in the polls compared to other in-party challengers to presidents of the United States throughout election history. We also know that even compared to Republican challengers to President Joe Biden, RFK Jr. is doing well. But there's another component, another development that actually would make RFK Jr.'s ascension in the Democratic Party more likely to happen as the Democrats are going to choose their nominee for president of the United States. And that is the whole primary order debacle. On the Timeless part of my show, I recently interviewed the New Hampshire Secretary of State, David Scanlon. He's a Republican, and secretaries of states throughout all of the states in the union are in charge of election procedures. And so I talked to him about this new announcement that the Democratic National Committee, at the direction of the Biden administration, has come out with, saying that they are going to move the primary schedule. For 50 years, actually over 50 years, the order has been this. The Iowa caucus is first for both the Democratic and the Republican procedures for picking their nominee for president. First, there's the Iowa caucus, then there's the New Hampshire primary, and then other states follow. But now, this year, for the 2024 presidential election, the DNC and the Biden administration has said, we are changing this. Before the Iowa caucus and before the New Hampshire primary, we are going to put South Carolina first. Why would they do such a thing, upending over half a century of precedent? It's because if you go back to 2020, President Biden did particularly well in South Carolina compared to the other primaries. In South Carolina, President Biden came in first in 2020 with 48.6% of the vote. But in Iowa, he came in fourth with around 15% of the vote. And in New Hampshire, he came in fifth with around 8% of the vote. So what the DNC is doing, because A, President Biden chooses the head of the DNC as head of the party and president of the United States, and B, because the DNC wants President Biden to be the Democratic nominee, what they are doing is that they're moving South Carolina first to try to get a big victory out front for President Biden. Because when you get a big victory out front in the primary season, it sets the pace and the momentum for the rest of the presidential contest. When you win the first primary, you're more likely to get media attention. You're more likely to get an increase in donors. So they're trying to pad it, if you will, for President Biden. The issue, though, is that New Hampshire has a state law which says that it is the state which is supposed to have the first primary in the country. So when I interviewed the Secretary of State, David Scanlon, I said to him, or I asked him this question, I said, okay, so the DNC is saying that they're going to hold a South Carolina primary ahead of Iowa and New Hampshire. But you have this state law which says that New Hampshire has to go first. So what are you going to do? Are you going to follow the DNC's orders and have New Hampshire just go behind South Carolina? Or are you going to follow your state law and have New Hampshire go ahead of South Carolina? And he said the latter. He said, no matter what, we are holding a New Hampshire primary ahead of South Carolina. So what that means is that it is actually pretty likely, though not guaranteed, but nevertheless probable, that President Biden's name will not be on the ballot in that New Hampshire primary because the DNC won't recognize that first New Hampshire primary as being the legitimate first primary because they want South Carolina to go first. So what will happen then? If President Biden's name is not on the ballot, RFK Jr. will probably win the New Hampshire primary because he is the Democrat, even ahead of Marianne Williamson, who is leading in the polls. So if RFK Jr. gets that win out front in New Hampshire because of this new primary debacle, it could, as I mentioned, lead to all of this momentum for him in that he gets more media coverage, more donors, and more faith that he actually may see the process through. So it will be very interesting to see what happens. But again, I urge all of us to really remember the lesson from 2016. Don't ever underestimate an outsider, especially when that outsider, like Trump and like Kennedy, has a particularly famous last name. We'll keep you updated on all of these developments. Just hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified with every new piece of content, whether it's Dennis and Julie, Timeless, or Julie Noted. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you soon.